When it comes to documenting popular culture, it's always difficult to pin down exactly where a trend began. Stealth games are no different in this regard. To some, Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear is the first example of a stealth game. A few suggest that Castle Wolfenstein, released several years earlier, is a more likely candidate. Others contend that stealth games only truly began in 1998, when Tenchu's stealth assassins, Metal Gear Solid, and Thief the Dark Project popularised the genre. As for me, I chose a more inclusive approach. I went back through gaming history in search of those elusive titles that used any degree of stealth-based gameplay. The goal wasn't so much to find the first ever stealth game, but to trace a vague path of influence and similarities between the earliest titles, to see how stealth-based ideas and mechanisms had evolved throughout the 1980s. I tentatively labelled this period as the decade of the proto-stealth video game, and I'm happy to stand by that as a core idea. There are clear examples in very early video games of stealth-based concepts, though they are far from the evolved standards of what many of us would call modern stealth games. Instead of plucking a singular video game or two out of thin air and saying, "Hey guys, this is the thing that started it all," I took some time, laid out the territory, and tried to scrutinise every stealth-based idea or mechanism I could find an example of. Eventually, I did pick a specific game, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and I called it the first video game to offer a comprehensive stealth gameplay experience. I felt that Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was a key moment in stealth game history, a marker of sorts that would help determine some parameters for future stealth games I analysed. But it wasn't, in a chronological sense, the first video game to use stealth-based gameplay as a core concept. Nor were Castle Wolfenstein or 005. So I wanted to set the record straight, at least as far as this series is concerned, and talk about some things. The stealth game that, until recently, had been forgotten, its influence, the developer who built it, and the games journalist who helped Western audiences to find it. In April 1980, Taito Corporation released an arcade game, Lupin the Third. Based on the popular manga series of the same name, it featured the titular Arsène Lupin, a master thief, as he scurried around a guarded level attempting to steal bags of money to impress his lady friend while being chased by Interpol agents. Although I came across Lupin the Third in my research for the very first video I did on proto-stealth games, and for some reason it's commonly cited as one of the earliest stealth games created, I found it difficult to justify Lupin the Third as a proto-stealth game. Unlike other proto-stealth titles, which typically feature obstacles that begin in a passive state before they can be triggered into an active state by the player's actions, Lupin the Third features enemies that are locked in either a passive state or an active state. In hindsight, I should have covered Lupin the Third as another example of a game whose core gameplay concepts may have influenced the development of stealth games. Time constraints and a bit of misguided over-analysis on Pac-Man's ghost enemies are probably to blame for that. So let's clear this up. Basically, Lupin the Third's Interpol agents are similar to Pac-Man's ghost enemies in that their movements are centered around the player's location. But unlike Pac-Man's ghosts, there's no subtlety involved. There are no patterns of convergence and divergence. In Lupin the Third, the Interpol agents chase you, constantly. The Interpol agents don't even need to glimpse Lupin, they home in on the player character as soon as the level begins. The player's only option is to put obstacles between themselves and their pursuers, steal a money bag when an opportunity presents itself, and choose their movements wisely. There are also guards and guard dogs who patrol the game space, but these characters won't try to catch Lupin if he crosses their paths. They serve as mobile barriers more than anything else. Lupin the Third is not an early example of a stealth game. It's a game of cat and mouse, where the cat is always aware of where the mouse is. There are clear differences in this approach to gameplay and the approach of what I call Proto-Stealth Games, in which obstacles remain passive until they're triggered into a state of active opposition. In many ways, Lupin the Third is similar to 005, where the player has to fetch objects and avoid capture by enemies, but 005 gains proto-stealth status by virtue of its warehouse environments, where guards armed with flashlights try to spot the player character as they move from cover to cover. What I didn't know about Lupin the Third was that it is likely to have been inspired by a proto-stealth game that predates the publication of Castle Wolfenstein and 005 in 1981. A game that was created by a university student in Japan nearly 40 years ago in 1979. To understand the story of the first documented stealth-based video game, we must first understand the story of a certain games journalist and historian. For the last few years, John Szczepaniak has been compiling a series of books, The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, in which he conducts frank and open interviews with a number of key figures from Japan's expansive games industry. It's only fitting that I give Szczepaniak all the credit for what I'm about to discuss here, because all of it was revealed through one of the interviews he conducted for his books. Szczepaniak's interviews have been fascinating to read in general, as they are densely packed with anecdotes and revelations concerning the early days of the Japanese video games industry, and I'd recommend that anyone interested in the history of video games as a whole should add his books to their collection of gaming material. All of this being said, the developer Szczepaniak interviewed was Hiroshi Suzuki, who began his career in video games at Taito Corporation. In the autumn of 1979, when he was still a student, Suzuki built what has so far been confirmed as the earliest example of a stealth-based video game, Manbiki Shunen. And because my Japanese pronunciation is terrible, I'll refer to it by its translated title, Shoplifting Boy. Suzuki developed Shoplifting Boy as a type-in listing for the Commodore PET 2001 home computer, one of the earliest machines of its kind, and, at the time, a very costly product. This was when computer memories were measured in kilobytes. Dedicated home gamers had to literally type in the source codes for games before saving them to floppy disks or cassettes, and then running them on their machines. As part of a computer club at his university, Suzuki and his fellow students produced a few games. Shoplifting Boy was one of the ones that used the Commodore PET 2001's programming language, BASIC. In his interview with Szczepaniak, Suzuki states that most of what he and his colleagues did was experimental. There were no tutorials on how to design good games at the time, they just came up with a few core ideas and built their games around those. Shoplifting Boy was inspired by Suzuki's trip to a 7-Eleven convenience store, where he noticed the high shelves and narrow walkways would be structurally tempting for shoplifters. He took this environment and transformed it into a game space, where the objective was to steal as much as possible without getting caught by the shopkeeper. According to Suzuki, it took him about a month to develop the game. This footage is from an emulated version of Shoplifting Boy. The game has multiple levels featuring the same layout. Each level begins with a cutscene of our thief entering a 7-Eleven shop, the brand of convenience store from which Suzuki drew inspiration for the game. There are 4 aisles dividing 8 shelves of goodies. Stealable items are symbolised by $signs. The shoplifter is able to move across and through these aisles, nicking produce as they go, while the shopkeeper patrols the area further above. If the shopkeeper gets too close to the player's current aisle, the shoplifter can scurry back between the shelves to avoid being spotted. To add a sense of urgency, there's also a countdown timer, at the end of which the police will arrive. Sadly, there are no additional non-player characters who appear and chase the player. The game simply ends with the shoplifter in jail if time runs out. If successful in stealing every available item, the level is completed and players can advance to the next stage, where they can repeat the process and increase their score. The game is over if time runs out, or if the shopkeeper spots you. As you might expect for an early Commodore-era product, Shoplifting Boy is simplistic in its presentation, but there's a certain level of charm to it. Suzuki took time to animate his character's arms and legs. Game environments for this period were typically static, so it was important for characters to be as dynamic as possible. Shoplifting Boy was one of a few video games Suzuki and his peers exhibited at a festival at his university in November 1979. The game's source code was later published more widely in RAM magazine's February issue in 1980, and Suzuki himself posed as the roguish shoplifter in the picture next to it. It was during this period that Suzuki and his fellow computer club enthusiasts caught the attention of Taito Corporation. Taito hired them to create concept games which they would pitch to the company for further development. All games presented earned them a fee, and if any were made into full-blown titles, the developers were paid additional royalties. According to Suzuki, Shoplifting Boy, though not picked for further development, heavily influenced Taito to develop Lupin the Third. Although both games share certain key ideas, including a main objective to steal as much loot as possible without getting caught, their execution of these ideas is distinctly different. Shoplifting Boy features a passive enemy as its main obstacle, the shopkeeper, that moves around the game space irrespective of the player's location. There is an emphasis on staying undetected, rather than running away. Lupin the Third features an active enemy as its main obstacle, Interpol agents that constantly chase the player. Despite not convincing Taito to pick up Shoplifting Boy for development, Suzuki went on to create a sequel, Shoplifting Girl, in 1980. This is normally the point where I would have some footage of the game on screen, but that's proven to be impossible, or at the very least, extremely difficult. What you're actually seeing here is a fan-made port of Shoplifting Boy, made for the more advanced NEC Corporation PC 6001 in 1982 by parties unknown. Emulated, of course. In a strange twist of irony, Shoplifting Boy's age and programming in the basic code format has made it more durable than many smaller games from this time period. Its source code was distributed freely, so it was possible for gamers to create and share new versions of the game. Shoplifting Girl was developed using more advanced software that was made available to Suzuki and his colleagues, which resulted in better graphics, better sound design, and more realistic characters. The downside of this was that it made the game more complex on a programming level, and so it was released on hard media, a cassette or floppy disk. Still, Shoplifting Girl was developed and released in 1980, which also predates Castle Wolfenstein and 005, both of which were released in 1981. Assuming that it follows the same basic rule set as Shoplifting Boy, with a passive enemy seemingly unaware of the player's location, Hiroshi Suzuki is responsible for the world's first 2 stealth-based games. Knowing my luck, by the time this video comes out an even earlier example of a stealth-based video game will have been rediscovered. But for now, Mr. Suzuki, I want to take a moment to acknowledge your work the only way I know how, by making this video and photoshopping your name and image onto a Guinness World Record certificate. Because they still haven't bothered to verify what's on their website. Thank you, Mr. Suzuki. May your legacy thrive in the shadows where we, the stealth game enthusiasts of the world, would appreciate it the most.